The Note by Brendan Bozeman. Franklin adjusted the hateful tie on his neck as he stared with fury at his bedroom door. Sunny day, perfect temperature, mitt and batting glove on chair, Saturday detention. When he finished dressing, he clomped down the stairs with deliberate, heavy steps, announcing power and reluctance. He had 5 flights of stairs to descend in his Beacon Hill residence, and he hoped the sounds would invade his father's thoughts like oncoming vengeance. His father had taken over breakfast duty that day because his mother or his nanny surely would have given him a special breakfast to console him for the long morning ahead, and he had prepared oatmeal and toast for him. Milk, butter, jam, and sugar were provided, but nothing more. Upon entering the kitchen on the bottom floor, Franklin at once decided he would not eat a bit of it. But as his father dispassionately placed the items on the table and began reading the newspaper, his hunger grew and he ate. "We'll have to go now," said his father as an alarm rang on his Apple Watch. He stood up, and Franklin did the same, although he looked at the floor with determination. "Do you have pencil and paper?" "They said I didn't need anything." "Is that true?" "Yes, it's true," said Franklin, glancing up for a moment. "No books?" "No." "Then let's go." Franklin followed his father down the narrow brick sidewalk of West Cedar Street. Birds were chirping as they settled on the budding trees, and a coolish breeze caressed their cheeks as if to wish them a fine day. They went up to Mount Vernon Street, where they turned right and went past Louisburg Square to find their Range Rover parked up on the right. The drive was silent. Mr. Witherspoon did not put on any music or news, and the ride to school felt long. Franklin could hear the brakes making a slight scraping sound as they approached red lights. Mr. Witherspoon, Winthrop, pulled up to the appointed place, where the door to the office, located in the Science Center, was propped open. Franklin climbed out without saying goodbye and went inside, where the secretary gestured for him to wait on one of the couches off to the side. There was already another boy there, probably a junior, who sat awkward and dejected at the end of a couch. Franklin took a place at the other end of that couch and, looking at the clock, saw he was 12 minutes early. After a few more minutes, another boy, an 8th grader named James, sat on a second couch and looked at Franklin. "Hi." "Hi." At 6 minutes to 8:15, an older teacher, Mr. DeGoss, came down the stairs to the waiting area and waved them in his direction. "Detention will be in the library," he said, with controlled disgust. They followed him. The library was in a separate building, and they had to climb a grand staircase, go through the dining hall, eerily quiet and heavy with the smell of a year's worth of accumulated spills, and go past the bathrooms, where Mr. DeGoss stopped and said, "If you need to go, go now, because you won't be let out of the room until the end of detention." Franklin didn't believe that could really be true. What if they were throwing up? But he nodded and entered. The other two did the same. No words were exchanged in the bathroom, and they avoided eye contact. They then went through an old room whose purpose nobody knew, just that it may have been the dining room of the old mansion, and that it had a curved ceiling where you could whisper on one side of the room and be heard on the other, even if the room was loud with voices. Then past an old greenish marble staircase and into the library, opulent and wood-paneled. It would have been highly impressive in its ancient life as a personal library, what with its shelves climbing toward the painted ceilings, and the giant fireplace carved with a snake and a Latin motto. It was full of old books that nobody ever read, and was furnished with tables and chairs that stood as a gesture to tradition, but which still ranked with cheaper furniture. Bits of pencil and paper were strewn on the ground, and the chairs had not been put in order after the last study hall on Friday. Another teacher, Mrs. Folgate, was there waiting. She smiled weakly, momentarily looking up from her papers. On widely separated tables were folders inscribed with each of the boys' names. They sat down in their respective places and opened the folder. There were 2 pencils inside. "If you need to sharpen your pencil," said Mr. Degas, "raise your hand, and I will sharpen it for you. The instructions in your folder should be clear, and there will be no questions." He sat down and began working on some papers, just like Mrs. Folgate. Franklin was hoping that his folder had math problems in it. With those, you just have to put your head down and start doing them. You can shut your brain off entirely, and before you know it, detention is over. He had, of course, served 2 weekday detentions already to be eligible for a Saturday, and his teacher had been kind enough, or possibly lazy enough, to stock his folder with a pile of busy work. Not this time. The instructions said, "Franklin, I'd like you to think hard about why cheating is a bad thing. Is it fair to others? Is it fair to yourself? What if everybody cheated? What would you think if somebody else cheated and got a better grade than you, even though you had been honest? What are the long-term consequences of cheating, especially if you do so in a later grade? Make sure you say exactly what you did wrong and address the importance of being honest in the future. How will you avoid making the same mistake?" Of course, Mr. Bassett would make him do this. Nothing could be more torturous. The answers were obvious, at least the ones he wanted. What was it supposed to mean to, quote, "address the importance of being honest," close quote? It was so vague. This is mind control, thought Franklin. The worst thing in the world is someone controlling someone's thoughts. He rolled his eyes toward the clock. 8:22. That's it? An hour and 53 minutes to go? An hour and 53 minutes. He pulled a blank piece of paper out. "Mr. Bassett." He erased this, put his name and date at the top, skipped a line, and wrote, with a number of spelling mistakes, some of which will be described for the listener. "Mr. Bassett, I am sorry I cheated on the test. Before the test, I copied answers onto a piece of paper that I put in my sleeve. I also wrote Thermopylae on 2 separate pencils, so when you put them together, you can spell them right. Also Miletes, but not Salamis. I got that one right. I just couldn't remember those ones and which came first, TH or Salamis. I forget Themialstes, the Greek general. I know it's not fair to others because because they studied hard and I really stole their points. It's not fair to me too, BEC period. I can't remember what happened in the future. If somebody else cheated and I got a worse grade, that would be unfair, BEC. If he cheated, I already probably got a worse grade and I was going to lose points anyway, The long-term consequences are I can't get into a good school, so I won't get a good job. The importance of being honest in the future is BEC, without a good job, you can't make any money. Your children will starve and you'll get divorced. Plus, my dad taked to me and some people become alcoholics. I will never do that again. Franklin had been checking the clock throughout this exercise, but by the end he was dismayed to see that there was still 1 hour and 7 minutes to go. 1 hour and 7 minutes. He looked into the folder. There were math sheets for him to do if he finished the composition. There was a good stack of them, but Franklin was glad to see them, and he got through them easily. He hardly had to think about them. They were simple, and he knew why. A friend of his, whose mother was a teacher, said that teachers give out easy work for detentions because the kids weren't supposed to have questions for the proctors. The proctors were doing their own work and didn't want to be bothered. Also, they couldn't always help students with the math. That had given Franklin a somewhat different view of teachers. They couldn't always help with the math? Weren't they supposed to know that stuff? He got to the last sheet, however, with 44 minutes to go. He slumped back in his chair and looked out the glass doors to a courtyard that overlooked the soccer field below. He imagined that whoever owned this mansion before would sit out there and read books. Probably he and his wife would have parties out there, too. A day like this would be a great day for a garden party. They had them on the hill sometimes, and they were popular with people like his parents. This would be the perfect place for something like that. With all the space, you could have a big party. Franklin wondered if they had a pool way back then, or horses. It was hard to tell because so much of the grounds were all school buildings now. The mansion hardly seemed like anything in comparison, especially to the Science Center, which towered 5 stories tall. He found himself tapping his pencil on the table, and Mrs. Folgate was staring at him. "Do you have nothing to do?" "I finished." She came over to his table and looked at his folder. Franklin could tell she would probably have something to say to Mr. Bassett for not giving him enough work. That made Franklin smile. Mr. Bassett wasn't such a good teacher, really. He could see that now. After almost a year with him, many flaws were apparent. Not only was he vague, but he gave a lot of busy work. That's what his mom said, anyway. But he knew why. Mr. Bassett didn't have a plan for the day. Half the time, he was just keeping everybody quiet. He would say, "Read a book," or give them, quote, "computer recess." Not because he was being nice, but so he could sit in the back and correct papers. Not that Franklin would complain about wasting time. That's what Oliver always said. If Mr. Bassett was just letting them go on the computer, and some of the kids took advantage of it and started fooling around, he would say, "Shh, it wastes time." Mr. Bassett kind of played favorites. Not as bad as some, but Franklin could tell he wasn't at the top of Mr. Bassett's list, based on what kids could get away with. He also wouldn't admit when he was wrong. Once, Wyatt pointed out something Mr. Bassett had gotten wrong on the math, and Mr. Bassett had denied it. He just erased the board and insisted that wasn't what he had written. But everybody could tell he had done the problem wrong, even the ones who couldn't tell on their own. If Wyatt said it, it was true, no doubt. There were always mistakes on the tests, too. Mr. Bassett always had to say, "Cross out number 4, or number 10 is supposed to say 24, not 13. Mix and matches always had multiple answers, and true and false were wrong all the time. Franklin thought Mr. Bassett actually never corrected the true and false. That was sort of cheating too, Franklin thought. But he could get away with it because he was the teacher. There was also one time he lied because he said he would give the whole class double recess if everyone got above 80 on a test. But he never followed through. He kept saying they would do it in a couple of days until people stopped asking. Franklin never said anything to his parents about these things. As soon as his foot hit the pavement after getting off the bus in the afternoon, the day was forgotten. There was no way to make use of it anyway. Prodding the teacher could only make things worse. The only time he would bring anything up was when he was in trouble, and it always rang hollow. But Mr. Bassett lied about recess doesn't hold any water when you've cheated or lied or sworn. His grandfather once gave him a piece of wisdom that Franklin felt in his gut applied to these things. His grandfather was Franklin Witherspoon II. 11-year-old Franklin was Franklin Witherspoon III. His father was Winthrop Witherspoon II. They alternated male names in the generations, so if Franklin had a son, he would be Winthrop Witherspoon III. So it went Franklin Witherspoon II, Winthrop Witherspoon II, Franklin Witherspoon III, Winthrop Witherspoon III. His grandfather had said that a little chaos can be a good thing. Franklin didn't know if it was the Alzheimer's talking, because he said he had learned that in World War II, which was impossible because his grandfather was still a baby when the war ended. His mother said that his stories were sometimes, quote, based on the truth, and that the message was more important than the facts. Franklin had a hard time seeing how chaos could be a good thing, but after much thought, he decided it was the same wisdom that Oliver preached. Limited chaos wastes time. If the fire alarm goes off, for example, that's 25 school minutes down the tubes. Mrs. Folgate looked around the room. Here, just find a book and read until the end of the session. She pointed toward one of the stacks that was apart from the other students, who had looked up and were observing Franklin with idle interest. Franklin shuffled slowly to the shelves, knelt down, and looked at the books. Every single one of them had dust on top so thick that it would cover his finger if he ran it over the top of the pages. The titles on the outside were so worn that they were hard to see, and he had to open the title page to find out what they were. They effused past decades with titles like The Children's Book of Patriotic Stories, The Store Boy, Rinkitink in Oz, Oliver Twist, and others he had never heard of. He didn't recognize any of the authors. He saw that the books still had library cards in the back. He knew what they were, though he had never used one, and he saw that they hadn't been checked out in many years. Looking through 20 books or so, the most recent checkout had been in 1985. That was around the time his father had gone to the school. He wondered if there was a book checked out by him, and he pulled several more off the shelf to see, but he found nothing. One got his attention, though. His father's name wasn't there either, but he flipped to the first chapter, which was entitled, See What the Children Are Doing and Tell Them Not to. He flipped a few more pages and saw, Teachers were the natural victims of my early hunting instincts. Mrs. Folgate cleared her throat. Franklin looked up to see her blink demonstratively at him, and Franklin stood up with the book and took it back to his desk. He slumped down again and flipped through. The book was huge, more than 300 pages, and the type was small. He looked at the cover. A bearded man with a sailor's cap stared at him. He couldn't tell if the face was kind or sad. The book was called Vagrant Viking. Franklin went to the second chapter. He wasn't a fast reader, so he skipped around, trying to find chunks of anything interesting. A boy named Peter was the main character, and Franklin figured out he was also the author. The students in the book hated their teachers and did some really bad things. They used a flame to heat a doorknob from the inside so the teacher would burn himself when he arrived. They made fun of the teachers for eating too much. They put a rooster in one teacher's desk. When the teacher went to get the headmaster, they threw the rooster out the window and then denied that there had ever been a bird in the room at all. But unbeknownst to them, someone had been passing by the school when they threw the rooster out and brought it into the classroom, saying, "Are you missing this rooster?" Peter was blamed because he always got blamed, but then the teacher thought that another boy, Jonathan, had helped him, and since Jonathan was the bishop's son, he didn't get them in trouble after all. Franklin looked up at Mrs. Folgate and Mr. Degas with such intensity that they both noticed, and he lowered his head again. He went to chapter 1. It was Peter's mother who had told the maids to find out what the boys were doing and to tell them not to, and it had offended Peter's sense of justice. Peter and his brother were very free and were allowed to sail on a small boat whenever they wanted to, even though they were only 6 years old. The neighbors complained that they brought their children along with them and that someone was bound to drown. And then one of the boys did drown, but Peter's parents wouldn't punish him or his brother because it was the other boy's fault for not knowing how to swim. Peter was subjected to just one rule, which was that if he fell in the water, he had to go to bed. So, if he fell into the water, he just stayed out until his clothes dried, even in winter. They did many mean things to their teacher, like putting firecrackers under her chair. She slapped Peter's friend, and then Peter attacked the teacher. And then they were expelled, and then they did something really unspeakable to the teacher, something so bad even Franklin was shocked by it and knew that he could never tell it to anyone, even as a joke, because anyone who found out would want to slap Peter and his friend. And since they wouldn't be able to do that, they would hold Franklin to blame. Some crimes simply need to be paid for by someone, and Franklin already knew it's often the messenger. Franklin got the feeling this could be the best book he had ever read. Everywhere he looked, he found another jaw-dropping detail of this boy's life. When he flipped forward to the halfway mark, he found that things had not gotten boring. The stories were still stunning, the only difference being that he didn't always understand what was happening or where. He decided he would check this book out and read every word of it from cover to cover. He glanced up at the two teachers, who had their heads down over their papers. It would not be a good time to ask. He slouched down into the chair and flipped further back into the book. And this is where he found something even more surprising than anything else that day. There was a piece of paper folded up and stuck in, seemingly at random. It was a detention slip, yellow and brittle with age. The date was Friday, April 15th, 1955. The name of the teacher was Mr. White. The name of the boy was Franklin Witherspoon II. Franklin's feet made a sound on the chair as he abruptly sat up, and the two teachers looked at him. He cleared his throat and pretended to put the paper in as a bookmark. When they looked back down again, He took it out again. It said, "Franklin has been reprimanded twice for swearing this week, and he has now been caught cheating." There was a line that said, "Detention date, Saturday, April 16th. Then it was signed by the teacher and someone else whose name Franklin could not read. Blood was rushing to Franklin's head, and he felt his face turning red as he realized that the current date was Saturday, April 16th, 2016. His throat felt thick. 61 years ago to the day, my grandfather sat in this same room for a detention for the same thing. The coincidence was astounding. It would have been amazing enough if the dates were similar, but the same date for the same infraction for a boy with the same name? Franklin's mind swam. His father loved stories like this. If true, he would be telling it every Christmas at the big party. But there were so many other questions. What was the detention slip doing in this book? Who put it there? Wouldn't it have been in a file somewhere? Franklin folded the paper up again and put it away. Only 3 minutes to go. He raised his hand. "Detention is not over," said Mrs. Folgate. "Yes, Mrs. Folgate," said Franklin, his voice croaking with emotion. "But I'd like to check this book out." "Check it out?" She and Mr. DeGoss exchanged a glance. "I suppose so." She looked around to find where he might do that. In the corner, pushed up against a bookshelf and supporting a lamp, was a small chest of 3 little drawers that looked like they might hold library cards. She waved him over. The card was still in the back of the book, and she took it out, looked at it, and handed it to Franklin. "You put your name here and the date there. I see the last time this was checked out was 1978. We had a big blizzard that year." Franklin looked over the other names. His grandfather's was not one of them. He held the card out for her, but she said, "You need to file it properly and get the return slip." Franklin couldn't figure out where that was, and she couldn't either, so they looked at the numbers on the spine and reconstructed how the Dewey Decimal System worked. She said, "You put the return date on this card to remind yourself and keep it in the back." "Should I put 4/29 or 5/1? Mrs. Folgate tried to suppress a smile and failed. "I don't think it much matters, Franklin. I doubt there will be too many other people waiting for it." Franklin smiled and put 5/1. "I might have to check it out twice. It's a long book. Why don't you just put June 6th? That's the last day before Prize Day." She lowered her face to look over her reading glasses. "And I'm sure you won't be back here before then." "No, Mrs. Folgate." It was time to go. The teachers collected the folders, and Mr. DeGoss took the boys back to the front door. Their parents were waiting, and Franklin ran to the car and jumped into the front seat with a smile. "Hi, Dad." "What's put you in such a good mood? Don't you know you just had a detention?" Franklin lowered his head and tried to look sad. "I was just happy to get out of there." His father did not notice that Franklin was carrying a book, which was fine with Franklin. He had a plan for it. His father said, "Now, I want to talk to you about how you are going to stay ahead on your studying, so there will be no more panic before the tests." Franklin said yes and no and tried to pay attention, but he was dying to get to their next stop. They were going to visit Franklin's grandfather. Normally, that made Franklin sad because his grandfather was getting worse and worse every time they visited. Franklin remembered him when he was much more alert, and they had gone hunting and fishing and everything else. There were many trips they had planned that they would never go on. His mother had said many times that they shouldn't keep taking Franklin there for his own mental well-being. but his father wanted to anyway. He thought Franklin Sr. recognized Franklin, and that it brought out his best qualities sometimes. Franklin was dying to show him the letter and the book. The nursing home was a 2-story brick building with many wings. It felt like a suburban condominium complex and didn't feel right to Franklin. He was used to visiting his grandparents in the Harbor Towers, where they had an apartment with everything on one floor. There was a balcony where his grandfather and grandmother would sit watching the boats, and for a few months, Franklin would play backgammon with him there. It was the deteriorating gameplay that made Franklin notice the slide. It got to the point that he really played both sides, with Franklin Sr. as a mere spectator. His grandmother still lived there, but spent a lot of time at the nursing home to keep him company. It had simply gotten too hard for her to care for him, even with the help of a nurse. She worried about how unsteady on his feet he was, and how he was hard to keep clean and properly fed. That day, it was just a father-son trip. Franklin knew they had a top-of-the-line nursing home for him, but he was unnerved inside the building. Seeing his grandfather didn't bother him. What made him uneasy was walking past all the different rooms and seeing other grandparents in various states of decay. Some would be in bed all the time. Others walked the halls. Some sat in chairs in the rec room, strapped in so they didn't slide out, watching TV or having nonsensical conversations with each other. There was a distinct smell, something like baby food, cleaning fluid, and a faint aroma of human waste. Nurses abounded, and they were always kind to the residents, never contradicting them, but redirecting their attention masterfully to keep them occupied and out of trouble. Franklin Sr. was watching TV in his room when they got there, and he greeted them kindly. "It's Winthrop," said Franklin's dad, "and this is Franklin, your grandson." With each identification, Franklin Sr. said, "Yes, Winthrop, and of course, Franklin. You don't need to tell me." Winthrop suggested they go outside and, noticing the book, whispered, "What's the book for?" "I wanted to show it to him." Winthrop nodded, and they made their way out of the building, checking out at the front counter. They found a bench for Franklin Sr. in the garden. Winthrop set up 2 chairs in front of him and threw a ball back and forth with him. It tended to bring Franklin Sr. out of his shell. After a minute of that, Franklin said, "Grandpa, can you look at this?" He took the detention note out of the book and held it out. Franklin Sr. put it on his lap. "No, read it, Grandpa." Franklin Sr. looked at it carefully. His eyes moved around the page. Looks like someone got in trouble. I hope it wasn't you." "Not really. Well, yes, but do you see the date?" He looked at it. That's a long time ago. I think I was in the place where I went to school." "That's right. It says you got a detention." "Did I?" Franklin leaned over to look at the note. Winthrop leaned over to look at the note. He looked at Franklin, shocked. "Where did this come from?" "I found it in the book," said Franklin. "Today in detention. I ran out of stuff to do, so they let me get this book. And that's what was in it." Winthrop was speechless. "Now, why would he do that?" said Franklin Sr., putting the note back on his lap. Winthrop spoke. "Dad, it says you got a detention. And so did Franklin Jr. just today." "Oh." Franklin took the note back. "Grandpa, do you know this book? It's where I found the note." He held it up for him. Franklin Sr. smiled broadly like he was seeing an old friend. "Peter Freuchen, of course. He was quite the adventurer. Have you read this?" "No," said Franklin. "Just a little. It says he got in a lot of trouble. He hid a rooster in his teacher's desk. Oh, yes. Franklin Sr. took the book and started leafing through it. I remember this well, yes. I read this book 100 times. Winthrop said, How did that note get in the book? Franklin Jr. scowled at him. He didn't want his grandfather to get thrown off the topic. Winthrop was somewhat put out by this, but he said nothing. I'll want to keep this, thank you, Franklin Sr. said, putting the book on the bench beside him. Do you remember your favorite part? Asked Franklin. The last line. That's a good line for when you get stuck. If you get stuck in life, you think of it. Franklin reached for the book and opened it up to the last line. He read, We are being punished because we have stayed too long in one place, PETA. Life is a journey without end. And all the rest of it, his grandfather added. Grandpa, it was in the school library. How did it get there? I must have put it back. But your name wasn't in the checkout slip. Franklin Sr. burst out laughing. He leaned forward, grabbing his stomach, and Franklin and Winthrop both put their hands on his shoulders to steady him. Franklin Sr. coughed as he regained his composure. I used to put library books under my shirt. I could never finish the books in 2 weeks, but I always returned them. I got another copy much later. It's right up by the right window, one shelf down, eye level. He was talking about their old library on Beacon Hill. All the books had been sold to the Brattle Bookshop when they moved. You can borrow at any time, he said. Franklin Sr. put the book next to him again. He had taken it right out of Franklin's hands. Franklin looked at his father. Then he said, Grandpa, what's next to you on the bench? Franklin Sr. looked to his right. Oh, here it is. You should take it. Don't do the things he did, but it's yours. Thank you, said Franklin, taking the book. But, Grandpa, how did you ever get the detention slip? What? Franklin showed him the slip. He had to explain it to him again. It's a secret, said Franklin Sr. I can't tell you now. The conversation gradually lost its moorings after that. They threw the ball back and forth for a little while longer. Then Franklin decided to open the book to a random page and read, and Franklin Sr. listened attentively and smiled, but made no comment. Franklin decided he would bring the book each time from then on and read from it. They escorted Franklin Sr. back to his room, and with the help of the nurse, he lay down for a nap, and he looked content. You never told me about that book, said Winthrop, somewhat jealous. Franklin smiled. We'll get another copy of it on Amazon before the library loan runs out, said Winthrop. It turned out to be harder to find than that, but he followed through on the promise. He and Franklin had a lot to speculate about on the ride home, but each one of them had the radiant feeling of someone who thinks a miracle has just happened. Franklin's mother was impressed, but she expressed concern that the detention had become a positive experience. Franklin had forgotten about the detention altogether, but his father hadn't. For Christmas, he had Franklin III's detention slip framed along with a printout of the email he'd gotten from Mr. Bassett about his detention, and they hung it in the living room where it would always be available as a conversation piece, especially when Winthrop retold the story every Christmas at the big party. It came to be known as the same date, same crime, same boy story. Franklin did read the book, though it was the longest book he had ever read and took months. He had to look up a lot of things online, mostly to figure out where things happened. But Franklin Sr. could sometimes tell him about what happened when Franklin read aloud to him. The nurses said he was, quote, accessing long-term memory. The face on the cover came to be more and more of a friend to him. It stopped looking sad or stern, and in later years, when he started to forget that what his grandfather looked like, their two faces merged. Franklin never bothered cheating again. Even if he failed, the consequences were easy compared to all the beatings Peter Freuchen took and gave, and all the impossible situations that almost killed him. And when the school decided to redo the library, Winthrop requested the school's copy, and he kept it in his wall safe until, when Franklin II died, Franklin III placed it into the casket.